Hey, it's great to be here or virtually here. I'm going to be talking about low context DevOps, helping DevOps find answers faster. So, a little about myself. My name is Tom Limoncelli. I am the manager of the SRE teams at Stack Overflow. I've been a sysadmin for, well, much too long, and I blog and I tweet, and I've written a number of books. I have, and if you believe the back cover of these books, I'm an internationally recognized DevOps pundit and system administrator. As I mentioned before, I work at Stack Overflow, which you've probably heard of, but you might not have heard of Stack Overflow for Teams, which is a new thing we have, which gives a private Q&A experience for your organization. Maybe we'll talk about that in a bit. So my talk has three parts. We're going to talk about high and low context cultures, low context DevOps, a phrase that I coined, and we're going to end by talking about leadership. So part one, high and low context cultures. I'm going to tell a bunch of stories in this talk. The first story is about a man traveling in a faraway land, and he arrives in this village, and he goes into one shop, and the shopkeepers won't talk to him. So he goes to the next shop, and they won't talk to him either, and he's very confused. So he goes outside and he sits by the side of the road, and he's thinking, what am I doing wrong? Well, a little boy walks up to him and says, "Mister, don't you know anything? When you come to a village, you first have to go to the elders and they'll bless you. And no one will talk to you until you have their blessing." And he says, "Oh, okay." So he goes to the elders, he gets their blessing, and then everything's just fine after that. Well, later that night, he's standing there and he's thinking, gosh, how was I supposed to know that? Well, at the same time, that little boy was sitting in his home thinking, how could anyone not know that? This is an example of a high context culture. I'll say a little bit more about what that means in a minute. But let me tell story number two. I mentioned before I work at Stack Overflow. Well, I started there 7 years ago, and on my first week, it was I was going through all the usual training, and I asked, well, how do we create a virtual machine? And my mentor sat me down and he showed me this very complicated process. And when I got to the end, I was like, wait, you mean this isn't recorded anywhere? There's no documentation? Like how would someone know all this? And the person who was mentoring me looked at me and he said, well, we expected anyone who could get through our interview process would just know this kind of thing. And I was kind of hurt because, I could be the biggest expert in virtual machine technology, but I wouldn't know the particularities of how Stack Overflow does things. And, so there I was sitting there thinking, how could I have known this stuff? And I wonder if my mentor that night was sitting in his house thinking, how could we have hired this, or how could this internationally recognized system administrator not have known these things? Well, as an interesting PS to the story, the next day my boss called me, and at the time our inventory of machines was being manually updated, something we've fixed now. But he called me and he said, "Hey, you created a virtual machine yesterday and you didn't add it to the inventory." Well, I could be the biggest expert in virtual machine technology, and I would have never known that there was this additional step of adding the machine to an inventory. In fact, my mentor didn't even remember to do that. So these are some examples of high context cultures. High context cultures are environments where communication is implicit. Things aren't written down. There's more of a collective history that everyone just knows. People have to read between the lines. Often what is not said is more important than what is said. These kind of situations often rely on long-term relationships and activities where there's personal face-to-face relationships, or maybe some kind of central authority like the elders I mentioned. Contrast that to low context cultures. where communication is explicit. There are rules and you are told the rules and you are expected to follow the rules. So knowledge tends to be codified. It's written down, it's public, it's accessible so that people can read the rules and know them. This kind of low context culture is more common in places where interpersonal connections are a short duration. So for example, at an airport, you're not there very long. So you have to learn the rules quickly if you're going to follow them. That's why at airports, there's all this signage telling you where to go, what to do, how to do things. As a result, in a low context culture, knowledge is more transferable. Sociologists who invented this concept of high context and low context have studied cultures all around the world, and they've ranked languages based on how high or low context they are. And while this is a generalization, it's not perfectly true. Eastern languages are known for being more high context, and Western languages can tend to be lower context. Another story. I'm from New York City, where Stack Overflow is headquartered. Actually, I live in New Jersey, and I take the train every day into Manhattan to go to work. Well, that was true before the lockdown, but you know what I'm saying. Anyway, to get to work, I go through Penn Station. And Penn Station, to me, is one of the most high context environments in New York City. The maps, I mean, it does have maps, but these maps are not usable. I assert that this map is only understood by the person who created the map itself. This shows two different floors, and it's not obvious how the two floors of the building overlap with each other or where the stairs connect. One of my favorite things in Penn Station is this sign. Look where it says 7th Avenue Subway. This is the perfect high context sign. The 7th Avenue Subway, 30 years ago, changed its name to the 123 line. So this sign only makes sense to people that know the history of the building. I often have a lot of extra time while I'm waiting for a train, and I'll just stand in this hallway and look for lost tourists and help them out. And to be honest, sometimes, maybe 60% of the time, I can give them directions verbally. The other percent of the time, I just give them a sad look and say, look, I can't describe how to get there. This is a very complicated building, but I'll walk you halfway and point you the rest of the way. That's how complicated this building is. Okay, so that's high and low context. Let's talk about low context DevOps. I assert that a DevOps environment should strive to be low context. And I hope you agree. I hope that you agree that you would rather work in a place where things are explained to you instead of you have to kind of guess your way around, that communication is explicit instead of implicit. And there are three ways, there's many ways you can improve you can raise the context of your DevOps environment. I'm going to focus on three of them for the rest of this talk. We're going to talk about carefully constructed defaults, making write easy, and ubiquitous documentation. Okay, let's talk about carefully constructed defaults. One way to make a environment low context is to have carefully constructed defaults. So for example, when a new employee starts, what tools do they need to get their job done? They probably need a PC, they need the software required to do their job, and they need access to various systems and permission within those systems. How many people, think about the last couple times you started at a new job. How long was it before you had these three things and could be fully productive? For a lot of the people I talk to, it's not days, it's weeks or months. I had one friend who was at a company for 6 months and she still didn't have the software that she needed to do as part of her job. She ended up quitting the company. So why does a situation like a new employee environment that is just takes a while to get everything set up, why does that situation stay that way? Well, it stays broken because as a new employee, you see the problem, but you can't fix it. You're the new person. You're not empowered to fix things. And experienced employees don't feel the pain, so they don't have that motivation to fix it. And even if you are motivated to fix it, fixing these kind of things requires working across silos. You have to involve everyone involved in the onboarding process, IT, InfoSec, engineering, even the HR department. And that is really difficult. I mean, think about where you work right now. If you wanted to change the onboarding process to make it better for new employees, how many different people would you have to talk to? And how would you even begin to bring those people together? So there's a new book out by Gene Kim called The Unicorn Project. You might be familiar with the Phoenix Project. That's he and others wrote that book. The Unicorn Project is an excellent exploration of how to improve this situation. And because he does such a good job, I'm not going to talk any more about it. Let's move on. So the next idea is make right easy. Another way of thinking about this is you want to make sure that the lazy path guides you to the right way of doing things. So for example, how many of you have ever written code that did a lot of encryption? So, well, you don't want to write that code yourself, so you use a library like OpenSSL. OpenSSL is probably the most popular way of making your implementing the code that makes HTTP into HTTPS, right? It implements TLS and all this other great crypto stuff. Except if you want to use OpenSSL to make a secure application, you practically need a PhD to get everything right. There's all these different settings, lists of crypto protocols and hashing protocols and all these different things. And it's so hard to get it all right. And even if you do succeed in getting it right, 6 months from now, those settings are going to be stale. There's going to be some hash function or something that is no longer considered secure, and your code is no longer good. Contrast that to some newer projects like LibreSSL, who decided we're going to make sure that the default is timelessly correct. If you are lazy and use our function for just listening on port 443, it's going to have everything correct in a timeless way. I think that's the epitome of how everything should be. If I'm lazy, I get the right stuff. So at Stack Overflow, we make sure that our CI/CD pipeline embodies our recommended practices. If you just go with all the defaults, you get the recommended practices. You can go against our practices, but it would take extra effort. Similarly, it's important that your base library includes key things that you want all code to include. So for example, I have a friend at a company who realized that it's hard enough to hire a good developer, but to hire a good developer that also understands the operational realities of writing large scaled web applications, that's even more rare. So they had to teach all of their developers how to write operationally sound code. Well, even that's difficult. So they said, well, why teach them? Why don't we just make sure that when they link to our base library, they get for free telemetry collection, standard flags, all the different things that make code operational for free. So, sure, you can disable those things, but that's extra work. And who would do extra work, right? So overnight, practically, all of their code, and certainly all their new code, became much more operational. We can use Make Right Easy all over the place. All of the subsystem, all the foundational tools of our environment should embody this practice, from our ticketing system to our monitoring system, config management, etc. The third thing we're going to talk about is ubiquitous documentation. And this is one of my favorite things because I'm an author and I like to write documentation, which I admit is kind of weird. And that brings us to another story. A couple years ago, I landed at London Heathrow Airport, and I took the train to Paddington Station. And if you've ever been to Paddington Station, it is beautiful. It's this huge historic train station. And when I arrived, the first thing I thought was, well, I need to get a taxi. And I was about to ask someone, where's the taxi stand? But I didn't need to, because I looked down at my feet and I saw lines on the tile floor that directed me to the taxi stand. Let me turn that so you can see it better. This is a great example of a low context environment. I had the information I needed on demand where I needed it in a format that I needed. It just says taxi and an arrow. I don't need anything more. I don't need the history of taxis or what kind of taxis or the price information. I just need to know taxis, that direction, and that's the amount of information I needed when I needed it. That was perfect. How can we do that in our environments? Well, spoiler alert, we can have deep links. Deep links, links that take us exactly to the place in the documentation we need to go. And we could put these links in our error messages, in our control panels, in alert messages, in our monitoring system, anywhere people might want info. You know who gets this? Apple gets this. I don't know if you've upgraded your Mac to the newest version of Mac OS, but they changed the default shell in the terminal window. And if you're not on the default, you get this message that says what happened, the exact command you need to get up to date with their new standard, and a URL that explains more. I think that is just a great example of information, the minimum amount that you need at the right time. So how can we create a culture of documentation where we have these URLs everywhere, where the documentation gets written? Well, I have tons of advice, but 4 things on this slide. So first of all, I think it's important that management sets expectations. They have to set expectations that a project isn't done until it's documented, and not just big projects. Every ticket that operators respond to, that's an opportunity to update documentation. The next thing is you should treat bugs just like software. People should file bugs about documentation problems. That way, these issues get recorded as technical debt. They go through the triage that other bugs go through. They get allocated resources and they get fixed. And it's important that they get fixed because stale documentation is dangerous. I have some advice about creating a culture of always updating as you work in that URL on the lower left-hand corner. And lastly, you need to have really good answers to the pushback that you're going to get. Developers are going to say things like, well, my code is the documentation. Well, that's not true. At a minimum, you at least need a documentation that tells people how to find the code, right? So expect some pushback and have good answers. If people need inspiration, if people don't want to write documentation, one way that I find works is to inspire them by saying, the more you document, the more you can relax while on vacation. In fact, a lot of engineers, they haven't taken a vacation in years and they don't feel like they can. Make documentation a major part of what they do with the focus of document the things that you would want people to know if you were on vacation. Some people that I talk to say, Tom, great talk, but what docs? My company has no documentation. And I think this is because people don't like, engineers often don't like to write documentation. Raise your hand if you love to write documentation. I would assert that very few of you right now are writing documentation. So for the remainder of the talk, I'm going to talk about why people avoid writing documentation and how we can fix it. And I think that there are 3 big reasons why people avoid writing documentation. First, they're unsure of the scope. It can be very intimidating to write a document when you don't know what the scope is, right? Someone says, your boss says, document this server or document this process. And you're thinking, well, how am I gonna, how much should I write? Should this be the bare minimum? Should this have tons of background information? And you get perplexed about how much should I have to write, so you end up writing nothing at all, right? You look at your watch, you realize it's lunchtime, and you leave your desk and you don't come back to that project. Similarly, having an uncertain audience causes a similar thing. Like, am I writing this for a peer that already knows mostly what I know and they just need a reminder of the highlights, or do I need to go into explicit detail? Do I need to assume that the person has their environment set up right, or do I have to go through the basics of creating their environment? And lastly, there's one other thing that I think that actually kind of captures these two, but adds more. And that I have to warn you, this is possibly the scariest slide I have ever presented at a conference. So if you're not sitting down, you might want to sit down. If you have a weak heart, maybe maybe you want to look away. Parents, avert your children's eyes, because this next slide is very scary. And this next slide is the blank screen. Every writer's nightmare is the blank screen. You just stare at it. Where do I start? What do I do? It is the worst thing that you can imagine for as a writer. And as someone who's written a number of books, I can tell you that this is a huge impediment to getting started. Now, just to clarify, for you Vim users, or if you're a Microsoft Word user, for you beginners out there, this is a blank notepad doc. For you more sophisticated people, and of course, it's trendy to have dark mode, so I can't leave that out. So yes, dark mode syndrome is a very real thing. While not a recognized medical condition, blank screen syndrome is very real. So what can we do about this? We could build templates. Templates are a great way of avoiding the blank screen syndrome. We can write in small batches. Like I mentioned before, every time you close a ticket, write a little bit of documentation. Every time you fix a bug, is there documentation I can write? Don't try to sit down and write a 50-page document. Always be writing. If every day you improve a document just a little bit, your whole corpus will get so much better. And as part of that, you have to include document updates in your work estimates. If something's going to take 3 days to do and 1 day to update the document, don't tell your boss it takes 3 days plus 1. Just say it takes 4 days. The last bit of advice I want to give is just capture the text where people are already writing. If someone writes a description of something in an email and it's a great description, reply to that person and give them a compliment. Say, hey, that was a great description. Why don't you paste that into our document repository? Similarly for chat rooms and instant messages, find where the documents are already being written and just repurpose that. Which reminds me of Stack Overflow. At Stack Overflow, people, engineers who would always tell you that they hate writing documentation, they write documentation all the time, right? It's just being written for other people. But it's easy in Stack Overflow because there's a specific scope. You have a very clear question that you have to answer. There's a clear audience. You know who wants the answer, and that dictates their experience level and other things. Plus, there's templates. There's wizards that help you answer questions and actually ask good questions too. So that's why I'm very excited about Stack Overflow for Teams, because it gives you that question and answer experience in a private mode just for your company. I'm not here to give a big sales pitch, but this is one of my big projects at work, so I'm very excited about it. My marketing department would like me to include this slide. Lastly, let's talk about leadership. So who's going to make all this happen? I've talked about a lot of things today. Who's going to make it happen? You're going to make it happen. Don't wait for management to make this. And I'm low on time, so I'm going to go super fast to these last slides. Don't wait for your management to fix these problems. Be the leader. And a leader, in my definition, is the person who goes first and makes it easy for others to follow. It's like that child, the kids game, follow the leader. The first person, they're making a lot of decisions, but what they're really doing is they're clearing the path for others to make it easy. So it might be difficult to come up with a document repository or a template system, but once the template exists, everyone else can use it. So remember, how do we get more people writing documentation, or how do we lower the context of an environment? We have smart defaults. We make the right thing the easy thing. We have ubiquitous documentation. And why don't we write documents? Because the burden of figuring out the scope and the audience and the scary blank screen syndrome, and how can we fix that? Templates, 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 repurposing text from where people already are comfortable writing, and come up with a central repository. That's my talk. Thank you very much.